Right. Hi, Ruth. So nice to
Hi.
see you again. Been too long, but we're all kind of stuck in our little
Yeah,
bubbles at the moment, connecting virtually. Um, Thanks so much for making time. And
my pleasure.
I would love to, because I know a lot about your story, and we've worked together for a couple of years now, but I would really love to start off with hearing how you got into, because I see you as one of the real weavers between movements, even with you, like the way you use your position in Lush to actually energize a global network that is on the ground trying to do the regenerative work that we now really need to do, and but also with strategy preparing for what's coming towards
Mm.
us, and building the human relationships and the capacities through all your work with sociocracy. I'm impressed by what you do, and I would love
Thank
to see what took you on this journey.
you. Oh, I don't know. I think I grew up in Brazil, and I think from early on I've always had a sense of the world. You know, like sometimes you grow up in a place, or you have a kind of a very place-based life. I think I also enjoy the world, and I loved science, and I was very curious. And I think I had a few early influences, mainly for my own family, my older sister, about ecology and the environment. And I got interested in this topic, but I grew up, it's interesting because when I'm trying to piece together my influences, I think actually one of the core influences was like, okay, growing up with someone that was studying college and biology, that was my sister. But also, I grew up listening to punk and hardcore
Me too.
in the São Paulo, punk hardcore scene, which really shaped my political views and really created that thing of like do it yourself and anarchism, and I think that I'm very grateful for that influence, because I think it just made me feel powerful. Like it made me feel that I have agency and power to change the system, to fight the system, to fight injustice. Uh, and then when my interest for the environment and the planet and also spirituality came, it kind of came on top of that frame. So I always joke that I'm too punk to be a proper hippie, and I'm too hippie to be a proper punk. So I'm,
But
holding spirituality and activism like together.
just briefly, because I resonate strongly with that, because I also always felt dancing between the punk and the hippie. But have you seen Al Noor from The Rules has recently written this? I think it's actually a book, but I only just saw the article that's called was it Mystical Anarchism, and
Yeah.
in it he redefined anarchism for me, because since my punk days I kind of got to the point where we need some form of structure, and it made the
Mm.
same mistake of defining anarchism as if there's no rule at all and no order at all. But he defines it much more in the sense of a subsidiarity-based system where people in place make the decision that matter to them, which is basically the regionalization, localization, and regeneration agenda. Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
but sorry, didn't
I
want to interrupt you.
No, I always, and then I mean, we're gonna jump forth and back anyway. I don't think this. I think this is gonna be a very lateral thinking interview, so I should go there.
They always are.
Because I think for me as well, that's why I went into sociocracy and understanding governance, because for me that's making sense of anarchism. It's like we actually need the tools and the processes to be able to self-govern, right? And I feel a little bit sad that like a small state has become so attached to the right wing or liberal economics that it made the left want a strong state, instead of the left also saying, actually no, we need power devolved to the people. And I think Brazil had some really great experiments about this when I was growing up. So I think that was also an interesting political influence. But I feel sad when I see the left so wanting a big welfare state, and the people that are actually asking for a small state are all the free market capitalists and neoliberals. So yeah, I think we need to like reframe how can we also aim for no states, but in a way that actually looks after people better, because people are looking after themselves.
I'm increasingly getting to understand how central the reorganization along the principle of subsidiarity actually is to the redesign of the human impact on the planet, because that's how life builds.
Exactly.
Like we will never be able to attune our presence with the presence, like the dynamics of ecosystems and this nested wholeness that isn't separate, where local, regional, and global are yet another boundary in our mind that we created. But to enable appropriate participation in this nested complexity, you have to give the people in the place to the right to make the decisions, to meet their needs, but of course in a saver type attitude of being in service to life creating conditions conducive to life. And if we all agree to that, and we build a political system that enables it, then we enable diversity, which is how life thrives and is creative and continues to, and if anything else just won't work. So yeah, again, I think that it is central, this restructuring of the political process to.
Yeah, I agree. And just to keep there, like for me, bookching is like my, my guide, and the idea of social ecology. And what he says that I really love, it's like you have what he calls first nature, which is this wild, life creates conditions conducive to life. It's how healthy ecosystems work. It's how our body works. It's like the patterning of living systems. And then we've created a second nature, which is the human nature. We created our institutions, our economy, our educational, our health systems that don't follow the same principles. So how can we integrate, first and second nature to create what he calls free nature, which is this alignment of like human endeavors to, the principles that have ensured that life has continued to evolve. It's like, what we say, how can you learn from fungi? What do we have to learn from our like plant ancestors and fungi ancestors that have gone through so many shocks and so many pandemics and managed to thrive, not only thrive. And for me, this is the key here. It's like, I've understood recently that it's really about life. Like, I think we can take the movement, and whether it's the political unfolding or the economic unfolding or business unfolding, life is at the core. Like, we're here to create more life. We're here to, increase complexity, diversity, order, differentiation. That's what, and what I like about this is it doesn't matter what your belief system is. Like, you can be atheist. Yeah. Yeah.
For me, that's so central, that if we continue, and this is what's paining me so much in being in touch, like you are as well, with a wide spectrum of the movement towards a healthier, better, saner world, to give it some kind of framing. Because there are people in industry, there are people working in the UN that really are passionate. They get up every morning with passion and meaning in their life, trying to do a good thing. Yeah? At the same time, in all the activist movements and the people who are saying that's the wrong kind of green, we don't need these kind of corporate green deals that ultimately won't work. They're also passionate, good people. But what I find frustrating is that we keep standing still, telling each other where we're just a little bit wrong and haven't quite got it yet. Or our strategy is mistaken, or you're still believing in that, how can you? Instead of understanding that the deeper intention to be in service to life, to do things differently in a saner way, is something that we all share. And that if we, and that's why I'm so obsessed with this, starting with questions rather than answers and solutions, because the minute you hold answers and solutions really lightly and understand they're never final and they're never fully correct and they're never perfect, you can allow everybody's opinion and you can still move forward together. Because as we walk shoulder to shoulder into the future, we can have the conversation about where we might be mistaken. We can improve our questions. But if we just argue with each other, we don't go anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this as well. So for me, it's like first, I think because we're in a moment that is really existential, and it's really about the existence of humanity on the planet. Like, I try to go as into like the essence of really what's on the table here in terms of like global problems, and the issue is existential. So I think we need to approach it with that kind of intention. That this is, I keep saying that because it's so existential, this is about humanity owning our role on the planet. This is about, the awakening for me is the awakening of us owning really what it is to be a human and an active participator in this community of life on the planet right now. But how we get there, I keep saying that, we have the revolutionary approaches and the revolutionaries, which is let's create a new financial system, let's create a new money system, a new educational system. And we have the reformist approach, which is, let's make an impact investment portfolio. So, even philanthropic capital is not being used to support fossil fuel companies or porn, and, like it is now. Or, let's change education a little bit. Like, I think we need both at the moment, as long as we have the revolutionaries, and as long as we're resourcing them, and as long as they are, focused on that task, and we create space so there are people that are fully focused on developing the new stuff. I think a lot of people can just reform where they are, and what, Joanna Macy says as well, like the hand actions, that are buying us a bit of time. Because we're not going to get the revolution done in 10 years. And for me, 10 years is what we have. So, I feel like we need everyone. And maybe just to go back to,
It's again, it's this, like I've heard myself say, right, and spread the idea that we don't need incremental change, that it's just not going to do it. We need transformative change for many years. But the both and of that is to say, can we not see, for example, right now, if some European governments are committed to a kind of Green New Deal response to post-pandemic reanimation of an economy that we actually don't really want to reanimate again, but in the process, it means building green infrastructure and finding ways to basically phase out entire industries, because we realize that there's no point in rescuing them now because they're basically making us run against the climate wall. It might only be incremental change, but who am I to know or judge how this incremental change shifts the overall enabling conditions that would then finally allow the transformative change to really land? So that's again, it's trying to do a both and. Like another way that I've sort of tried to play with this lately, because in our movement, lots of people are saying, it's the movement from ego to eco. The Otashama tribe, ULabs, very much, it's these two, the pyramid and the circle. And I'll just quickly show it. I don't know if you've seen this. If you apply the triad to this, and you see ego and eco as an expression of life's, we talked about this briefly earlier and before we started recording, that we are actually all of it, that flow. But we're also in our experiential space, we are being for ourselves. So the tension of all life is between being for oneself and being part of a larger whole. And both of them, that's the paradox of existence, that we're all of it, and we're a manifestation of it with a viewpoint. And if you just, rather than seeing it as a pendulum swing of saying, we've created a world all about ego, and now we need to just leave all that behind and become eco and put ourselves in the circle of life as one member in the community. I don't think that's taking responsibility for how much we fucked things up,
Yeah,
and also for the special role why we came here. Because if everybody in
exactly.
their essence has a place, then we do too.
Yeah.
As badly as we've done the job so far, maybe. And that's why I love this. When you put it into the triad and you see that seva, the ancient notion of being in service to life, to a larger whole, to the process, it's been around for 3,000, 4,000 years. I don't know when the Vedanta was written. And for me, that's the resolution. And it again would then allow us to communicate with all the people who are still trapped in the ego race, in what Joseph Campbell says, getting to the top of the ladder and realizing it's leaning against the wrong wall. Yeah, that kind of notion. There's so many people still trying to get up that ladder, and the people who just got to the top are going, this is lonely and meaningless.
Yeah.
But to talk to them, you need to also honor that taking care of self is important. And both of us know how quickly you can burn out if you forget that. And I'm in a position right now in my life where I feel like I need to take care of my family, my community, my health in order for this to be like, for me to be of service in the long run. And if I burn up like a flash fire in a couple of years of just thinking about out there and not caring for my community and my immediate family, I'm not of service to anybody.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I want, so we're going everywhere, but I would like to come back briefly to your story, because like, so how did you end up in Europe? And because yeah, please.
So yeah, I think I have a really interesting biography and connected to psychedelics. I don't know if I can share that here, but I think I can see like the turning points in my life, and like when I say that in this video game of life you changed levels. You saw the monster, you like fought the monster, and then you went to the next level with like new weapons and new resources. I don't know. I'm not a gamer, so excuse if I don't have the right metaphor. But I think one key thing that the first time I ever took LSD, it was very small amount of LSD. I was at a rave trance for the solar eclipse. I came back from that trip like so in tune with the earth that I was a vegetarian. Like I turned into a vegetarian. I started doing yoga. I became an environmentalist. It was like overnight. I cannot explain like the like really being able to feel love. I think it was the first time in my life that I could really feel the sense of interconnection at a much deeper level than just reading about biology or ecology. Or I also studied physics at the time. I went to university to study physics because I was really fascinated by the universe, and I wanted to be an astronomer. That was my main goal. And then these experiences allowed me to like turn back to the planet, turn my attention from the stars and turn back onto the planet. And this fascination with the universe, I think, just kept growing. And then I came to Europe just because I wanted to live in London for a while, and I ended up working for Lush. I was doing something completely different in Brazil. I was teaching yoga and being a translator and interpreter and teaching English as a second language. And then in London, I said, I'm just going to be here for 6 months. I'm going to try to get a job with a business that I believe in. I was already vegan. I was already into animal rights and into more environmental activism. And then this was 2004. And then I started working for Lush in the shop as a sales assistant. And then, I was a bit bothered by some of the things that I considered greenwashing back in 2004, which is like, okay, if we want to be an ethical business, why do we have this? Like, why are we doing this? Where's like energy efficient lighting? And like, how are we going to recycle the waste from the stores? And then like the owner of Lush, who's like the big boss, one of the owners of Lush walked in, and then, I think he's someone that's used to getting like a lot of attention from people, and I just grilled him. And then he said, okay, do you want to do it? And I said, yeah, hell yeah. You know, I have this policy of saying yes to life. Yeah, and this is how it started. And I became like the environmental officer for Lush. Like it was, you know, it's an accident, right? And then I think as I became more aware of management systems and teams, and like also the, you know, the kind of dark side of power, and not even like Lush is a pretty cool place to work, but just already understanding a little bit more of how can I uphold my anarchist values, you know, as I'm also working in a more business sector. Then I went fully into dragon dreaming, sociocracy, holacracy, like, and then this idea of, again, how can we align? I went into permaculture and all, because for me it's the same pattern. It's like living systems based approaches that, you know, allow us to organize the human endeavors in a way that's more aligned to
So,
life.
so did you get into the link with permaculture after you already got the job with Lush, and so it was part of your job, or were you already connected there, and then brought that into Lush?
I think the second. I think I became. I think I already knew about permaculture and eco villages already. I think also one of the things I wanted to do when I came to Europe was to do an ED. That was also one of my things. I want to do an ED in Feinhorn was my goal. I ended up doing it in Tamera, which was a whole experience in itself. That was also really shaped who I am too. And yeah, and then I remember I organized the first introduction to permaculture at Lush. I think it was 2009, so maybe over 10 years ago, or even less. And then, you know, and then I think at the same time, people like Simon Constantine, who has been super important in the building the dream of Lush to become a regenerative business. I think he really fell in love with permaculture, and then, you know, the whole thing ended up developing in a more structured way, like with the buying team actively seeking out permaculture projects, and us actively funding regenerative design and agriculture and permaculture, and I think we've expanded from there.
That's I think the first time I heard about the link between Lush and the eco-village movement, and particularly through Kosher and Sieben Linden and Martin Stengo and the EDE there, and then I think it was through Paulo. He taught, or he was on one of those EDEs, and then he ended up through the Gen network helping to build some of these links for where small suppliers like growers would actually start growing for Lush directly, and that was must have been around 2009, 2009, I guess.
Yeah, I think so I met Paulo, and then we ended up moving together. So, you know, we became partners 2009, and then I was already working for Lush, so, you know, we were trying to bring more influences. But I think from it was actually a really beautiful thing that happened. I took 6 months off Lush, and Paul and I were living in Portugal in a project that he was helping to build, a strawberry building, you know, like living the dream. Living in a yurt with an outside kitchen and a wood-fired bath and compost toilets, solar hot water, permaculture gardens, all of that. And then we started writing this vision for Lush, and it was because we wanted to go back to Brazil and create this. We had this vision that you could create community with what we call a biorefinery, so no longer a factory, but just like how can we take plant matter in really interconnected circular design, and, you know, produce raw materials, but soap, but also essential oils, and use the waste to grow mushrooms. Like, you know, we designed that whole thing, like really connected to permaculture designs and renewable energy and community and all that. And then we presented that to Lush, and like they, you know, they loved the vision. So they said, of course, this is totally utopic, but why don't we start? And then they invited Paulo to join. And this is when Paulo started working with Simon, and then using the huge network of permaculture and Gen and the Global Eco Village Network to identify key partners that had already the permaculture framing and had already the right kind of I think the right frame. So instead of trying to develop like standard farming practices, they were working with people who already understood it, and then allow them to build their businesses in a way that could fund Lush, and of course could send raw materials to Lush, with Lush funding them. So they had this idea of financial succession where, you know, Lush slowly reduces investments while the local business with a network of farmers increases.
It's a sort of process of active incubation
Yeah.
that not only builds up a responsible and regenerative supply line, but actually also helps in the place a whole community pattern to develop. I mean, it's wonderful.
It's also regenerative development. It's not easy, and we made so many mistakes, and a lot of projects didn't go well, and you know, there were trust issues. There were issues where, you know, you count on a certain yield, you know, like there are also business pressures there where you make, you know, you build your business case, and then if the yields are not correct, because maybe you're trying to grow things that should not be grown in that place, or that you know, you're trying to grow things organically and it may take longer in order to get the yields that you're used to by the industry that's not operating from the same principles. And so I think that but we had some really successful projects as well, like with GPI, the Ghana Permaculture Institute. Like they've been supplying moringa oil to Lush for 10 years now, but with a large network of farmers.
But it is, I mean, what you were just explaining, we've had these conversations before about the stories of where it worked and where it didn't work, and how it also sits in the larger, like, as a business like Lush grows, the demand, we're not talking, oh, can you send us 100 liters of olive oil or 50 liters of almond oil? Like we're really talking about production that is so large that the administrative effort of getting it from 50 small producers rather than one large producers brings up the cost hugely and the insecurity. But well, that's the question. Is it really, because in a way it's more resilient to have lots of diverse suppliers? And it always makes me think of like this recent, like a couple of years ago, when Yvon Chouinard published something where he was basically lamenting that, basically along the lines of, they called me up and they said Patagonia is $1 billion business. Oh, I was dreading that moment. How can I do what I'm wanting to do in a company that big? I'm too big not to fail. And I find that fascinating, because it even with the kind of, I know it, like having talked to Simon, I deeply believe in the commitment of the impulse of Lush. Like they are basically whatever the real company name is, cosmetic warriors rather than Lush. It's a bunch of activists that started a company rather than a company that did some activism. Which I really, when I've learned that, I'm deeply impressed by that ethos. But then they're still stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's this conversation of, can you build a regenerative company in a degenerative economy? And at scales that just don't work. And so for me, the big challenge for all these leading companies is, like what we were talking about earlier, subsidiarity. How can we build that into company structures? How can we build global networks of lots of small companies that somehow still create collaborative advantage between them, but where the supply chains are just smaller, where Lush becomes many, many Lushes everywhere.
I think I always like to use the idea. We talked a lot about this with Tamara and Blueprints. It's like human scale. You know, how can we have human scale development? And then, I mean, at Lush, sometimes we do feel like, wow, you know, there is this enormous business now, which is super complex. And then if you try to, if you have a central brand, you know, the more the business grows, the more complex it is to build coherence, right? And you want to build some coherence in the system. And then something that, but also, like, I'm a little bit of a dreamer, and I know I'm like super utopic, but what I've been trying to talk about more recently is that earlier conversation we were having as well about like transformative change. you know, an incremental change. So how can we grow the business while transforming the system that we're sitting in? And it's the thing of like, you know, we have the train on the track and we're trying to change the track as the train is running on top of the track. I don't even know if it's possible, but I'd like that commitment. I keep joking, how can we create the post-capitalism while being inside capitalism and create a business that can actually build a bridge to the post-capitalist world? I think that's an interesting challenge for brands now. Like we know capitalism has failed. So what is our role in helping to redesign the post-capitalist world and like help redesign this new economy system? But in order to be alive so we can redesign it, we also need to survive now in the current system. I see that this is the paradigm. So and I think what Lush has been doing really well is seeding a lot of things and a lot of initiatives that can exist outside of Lush. And I think we could even do that more, where I see Lush as an ecosystem of different business entities. And if you can really, like in true regenerative design, think what's the essence and the potential of each one of those entities that allows them to almost develop in, not in complete dependency to this ecosystem, but actually develop in its own right. So if we get to the point where we need to, you know, regionalize everything and global supply chains are completely broken, we can still survive. Like, you know, like slime mold, you know, like now we're like one organism, but how can we strengthen all the individual parts of this organism so they fully understand what their potential is? And then when it's time, you know, to seed and to grow, they can be their own entities.
In many ways, it's in just the business world question. It's the same question that I feel like we're actually having to grapple with globally as a species. Like in this wonderful definition that John Stewart has of how evolution works. It's a process of diversification and then subsequent reintegration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity
and emergence, right?
And that this reintegration of diversity at higher level of complexity can only happen through the emergence of new patterns of cooperation. And through our life, that's how it has worked. But that means that we've in the push towards this globalization thing that had lots of negative impacts, but also had some positive impacts, and it's what we've now got. So there's no point in arguing about the past there anymore. And it's how do we make it healthy is to understand that we've focused so much on the global and the large, on the economics of scale, on efficiency, that we eroded the patterns of redundancy and duplicating at multiple scales in order to create capacity for self-regeneration at all scales of the whole. And so whether it's in our political systems, in our companies, in the way we live our lives, it's not giving up the global. It's strengthening it by becoming much more local and regional again. And I think that pattern, like if companies move into that space of like taking, for example, the circular economy pretty serious, and particularly the insights from the early industrial ecologists, that the biggest bang for your buck in circular economy is when you shrink the magnitude of the cycle. Like when you make it more local, more regional, you can get much more efficiencies or right practice at that local level. But of course, in the current economic system, there is no. It would only work if we go out of the bubble of the three sectors. Like that's when you have to have a political conversation with the people in the region and saying, we as a company want to devolve into really becoming supportive actors in this region. But that means we need conditions that enable us to do this with you across sectors, because it's like if we don't somehow erode this business, public authority, civil society separation, we're not going to create integrated community solutions.
But then we're back to anarchism, right? Where like the workers own the means of production, right? There is no, and again, I'm going to say something really, really revolutionary, which is about private property, right? So in nature, there is no such thing as private property. So for you to go beyond these three sectors, like also ownership needs to be in the hands of the people and not in the hands of the shareholders that are always maximizing shareholder value. So and this is why governance and ownership is a big conversation, and this is why I worry that sometimes that the regenerative movement or the permaculture movement, they don't get political enough, because the kind of changes that we're talking about here can truly only happen if we also own that everything is political and that the movement is also political. And, you know, how are we going to create the new kinds of regenerative politics and regenerative governance to support regenerative agriculture and to support regenerative manufacturing, you know? Yeah, so I think that's one thing that I wanted to just park there for now. And the other about relocalization, it's at the moment as well, like, for example, what we see at Lush is that because we've developed global supply chains and we have all of these developing countries that are, you know, basically their economy is completely reliant on commodities, like Brazil or like Sierra Leone. So we wanted some new cocoa butter because we were going to launch a new product, and we're like, okay, let's find, you know, a really super beautiful cocoa butter. And then because we have the ecosystem of Lush, which is global and has scale, we can then also support really incredible projects for bioregional development. So you know, often, I've been saying this to Lush, I think now it has finally been understood. Sometimes we don't need to do anything. We just need to be the private sector partner. You know, when we're talking about these blended finance or blended models that go above, you know, bioregional or landscape integrated management, it's amazing to have the power of a large private sector actor that can come and say, we'll buy your product. Get the finance, get the development, get the governance right. All we can do is buy your product. You have a guaranteed market. Also, there's an enormous power in that at the moment. So it's like, it really, for me, is this, but we need to have the transitional roadmap. I also don't like calling it a roadmap. We need to have the right principles in place that can guide the evolution of the system into these new integrated levels, you know, of complexity and order, which for me now, at least in human nature, is the post-capitalist world, right? So let's diversify, do lots of multiple parallel experiments like happen in nature, so we can integrate at this higher level of order. And, you know, maybe it's the free nature where we've integrated, but yeah. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're in this unfolding. Yeah.
But I mean, that's why, like, Joanna Macy's image of the hospicing and midwifing and the dying system and the birthing system is, it's a long journey, and it's been going on for a long time, and it's kind of accelerating to some extent that we're now seeing that this system is clearly dying. But what I recently really connected with deeper in this metaphor is that if you call it hospicing, when I hospiced my father, I realized that all the anger and all the, oh, that wasn't right that you did back then and all that, it disappeared. The judgment was gone, and there was a celebration and a forgiving of understanding that he himself was a traumatized and wounded being and tried his best in his way. And so I could be with him in a different way. And in a similar way, I find that we're not doing the hospicing right if we yell at the perpetrators of the dying system. Very few of them were, like, some of them are real perpetrators, like the current president.
Bolsonaro. Yeah. I was gonna mention him and say, sorry, I cannot be empathic. I just feel hatred and anger.
I was already in the process of mentioning him when you said but that doesn't mean that it brings us back to like, for example, I have a little bit of a connection to this whole impulse of future stewards and Nigel Topping with the We Mean Business Alliance and how they really work with the COP process now to to move forward the role of large industries in decarbonization and all that. And I know how many activist friends of mine would feel that world highly suspicious and so on. The same with like the wonderful work that Christiana Figueres and Tom Karnak have done with the world we create. They're in that process. They're still dealing with that system, but I know that they have deep integrity and really care and really want to be of service. And so for me, it's like I want to come back to the private property. On one level, I can sense in me that there's sort of two responses to that. On one level, I've also in the last few weeks, like actually in a conversation with John Fullerton, it sort of landed in me completely that one way of summing it all up, that is rooted in all indigenous knowledge from all corners of the world, is that it literally is a fundamental mistake to believe that the land can belong to us, rather than to understand that we are expressions of the land. We belong to the land. And the only way we can live in serving our enlightened self-interest is to heal and contribute to the abundance of the land that we are an expression of, that we are means of generating abundance for, through, as. And on that level, I completely agree with you that on the other hand, I also, it's the whole participation. How do we, like, we need to transform education. We need to bring everybody into responsible, appropriate participation in this process. But with getting ownership and getting rights comes the responsibility of also being a steward. And what I'm currently worried about is that if I know that there's a huge amount of vested interest of people who own something, and it's like when we say we don't need private ownership, like we often think of the Jeff Bezoses and the Elon Musks, where it becomes obscene, the kind of, it's even unthinkable what kind of sums and amount of resources they've amassed in the ownership of one person. But then all these wonderful projects that own their land in order to do their healing of that land, to have some sort of radical revolution that takes all of that away, and we all get our whatever our footprint percentage hectareage is, and then the only way to manage it, some well-meaning techie guy comes in and says, don't worry, as long as you have a mobile phone and everything you do gets tracked, then we know exactly how many resources you used and what you owe and what you don't owe, and all your social relationships. When you help that lady across the street, you get a bonus point in social, and when you do that, when you plant a tree, you get a bonus point. And that's crazy. That's Big Brother watching you. It's a technology. It's us saying we give ourselves over to the AI and to these technologies, as much as they're well-meaning. So I'm a bit concerned about how we're actually, without.
But I think then again, it's to go back to utopia, right? This is like the utopia. So in the utopia where we fully align human systems to living systems, I think we go back to the commons, and we are common stewards of the commonwealth, right? This is the common earth, like the Common Earth Alliance, I love that name. And there's so much work being done around the commons. And again, because this is a transition, it doesn't mean that suddenly we're not going to have any private property and we're going to like give everything up. And, like we need to create the right relationship. We need the right consciousness. We need the right relationship. We need the right governance, because we also don't want a state government that owns everything. We've done that before. Yeah. We have also seen how that pans out. And now we're in a state where everything has been commodified. So we own everything. And then, the carbon markets and the whole climate change, the response to climate change was, how can we commodify even the air? How can we commodify forests? Exactly. We've commodified everything. So I can own people, I can own intellectual property, which I find crazy. Like we can own culture. I can own a song. I can own poetry, I can own, life, we can own genome, we can own DNA, we can own the genome. Like,
Crazy.
like it's crazy. So it's like this pendulum swing into like full ownership of everything. And I think in this world where we go back to the commons, I think it's also a transition. And I think the first thing is to protect what is still the commons.
Mhm.
And then this idea of rewilding, and then rewilding land. So there are some ownership structures where we can buy land, and making sure that's not owned by people. It's maybe owned by an organization and held in perpetuity or protected in perpetuity. I think there are some, even Lush, for example. Lush has given, Lush is part employee owned.
Mhm.
So we are, and the idea is to continue growing the shares that are owned by employees. I think we're seeing so many
Yeah, yeah,
employee
no.
owned enterprises. Like, it's a beautiful movement. And I think, yeah, how can we also, again, to go back to that metaphor where we have to survive in the current system while trying to change the fabric of the current system at the same time. And yeah, and I think we're just going to be in this dance until either we move towards extinction if we're not successful, or we move towards, emergence of these new crazy properties of life that I want to see.
I think that, like, I think it's all happening. Like, sometimes I need to try to relax back into the trust that we spoke about earlier before we started recording, that we are actually, in everything we do exactly what we do as that larger flow. Like,
Yeah.
we can't do but, like, in more kind of academic terms. Like, I recently find myself quoting um, Gerald Mitchley, professor for system science at the University of Hull, who I know through the IFF, almost in every conversation, with this sentence, everything is an intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, if you
Yeah.
really sit with that sentence on
Yeah.
a cushion for a bit, or up on top of a mountain, and just repeat everything is an intervention, and really let that sink in, poof, it's a pretty powerful statement that connects to exactly the same place. Well, actually, it's not even just an intervention, because then it feels so much like you're doing something to the system, but you're actually doing something as the flow. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And for me, that is trusting that we'll never get there. Like, we need to imagine these utopias. We need to, I think we desperately need a sort of lighthouse or North Star that says, as humanity, in all our diversity, with all our disagreements, celebrating our different points of view as part of life's diversity and the source of our creativity, we can still find a common ground to move forward, which is the common ground that all our indigenous ancestors have given us, which is, if it's not in service to life,
That's it.
it's not appropriate. And
So, yeah, evolution has one direction, right? Even if you don't believe mysticism, even if you don't really want to believe the indigenous epistemologies, like whatever, like even if you believe pure Darwinism, like evolution has one direction, and that direction is towards more differentiation or diversity, towards more order, and towards more complexity. And we are, also life unfolding itself. So for me, that's the very base. It's a core principle of all of our decision making. Is my intervention aligned to this or not? And if not, we also know that extinction is also a valid process in evolution. Extinction is also how life unfolds towards more complexity, diversity, and order. So
no,
yeah.
I mean, that the whole thing, that life is basically a syntrophic process. Uh-huh.
Yes.
That we are negentropy, that we're moving against the tide of entropy in order to create. And of course, and it doesn't violate the second law of thermodynamics. It just, the mistaken thing is that is confusing time scales of physics and human evolution and biological evolution. Uh-huh.
And
we
yeah.
we can create more complexity and order in a pocket of the universe for a few million years, or even hundreds of millions of years, But that doesn't mean that in the long run, entropy doesn't hold.
And there is a brilliant theory. I think it's from 2014. I'm really bad with names, so forgive me. I'm not going to remember. I'm going to have to reference later. But there was this theoretical physicist in the UK that postulated that actually life created life, like, so the move from inorganic to organic life was a way for the atoms and the molecules to dissipate energy more quickly. So by organizing into a living entity, you dissipate energy more quickly. So you're actually, like, life is because of the second theory of thermodynamics, you know, like he brought everything together. And then for me, it was such an insight, because it also then, I can also connect that even to a very highly spiritual level, you know, like it for me just aligns everything, and aligns this unfolding of complexity towards, you know, entropy, but also towards consciousness wanting to expand and wanting to know itself so we can evolve higher levels of consciousness. Like, I hold those two things. Like I also really love science, but I also really love mysticism, and yeah, and I'm happy that I can hold all of those frames. And then just, I wanted to go back to one thing about evolution and life, and yes, to also honor something that I think for me is becoming clearer and clearer, and maybe part of the work that I'm doing now is to address that. It's how wonderful that you and I have the privilege of being able to have this conversation. Yeah, because our basic human needs are met, because we have the privilege of doing lockdown in you know, under shelter. We're not suffering the worst you know, storm like they are in Bangladesh, you know, like worst historic floods. We're not, we're safe. And I think from safety allows us to have this deeper thinking. But we need to bring everyone with us, and the people whose epistemologies and whose cultures are already so close to being regenerative cultures are being decimated at the moment.
Yeah.
So how can the work that we do really be in service of, like, support? Because that's where the richness, like, they are the people that are outside the system. They're much more capable of thinking outside the system. They already are outside capitalism. They've already fallen through the fringes. They have not lost their sense of the commons. They have not lost their sense of community. Yeah. So how do we support them and resource them in a way where they can be here having these conversations with us, where they also have time to influence us and support us? And I just keep naming that because I also sense that this is going to be the source, you know, as you're mentioning indigenous communities, this is also going to be a source of knowing that's important for us to connect to, but not only to connect to create space so we can thrive and develop. And at the moment is just being, you know, wiped.
I've been touching on that a lot lately in my reflections. Like I feel, like, for example, yesterday, was it yesterday? No, on Wednesday, I talked with Alex Pryor from Guayaquil and with Martin von Hildebrand from Gaia Amazonas. And they're doing a really wonderful partnership where Guayaquil is helping Gaia Amazonas in their work with the indigenous people in Colombia, in Amazonia. And I'm sure you know that Gaia Amazonas and Martin von Hildebrand has helped to basically, they've helped to facilitate the process that led to the turning over of 16 million hectares of Amazonia to 35 different tribal units, nations, peoples that now have legally the ownership of that land. There's issues with, of course, they have the ownership of the land, but the subsoil, according to Colombian law, is the state. And
same everywhere. Land rights, an important, very important part of this conversation.
But what I found really interesting in listening to Don Martin about his process with the people is that it really addressed the paradox that we're running into with this, because the minute you engage, everything is an intervention. So you also intervene in their cultures and you bring a connection in a different type of, so, but again, it can be positive and negative, like like very much linked to technology. The story that Martin was telling, is that the elders approached him and said, something is going on. Like on the one hand, wonderful, we still have our larger frameworks of meaning that give us clear patterns of how to participate in this forest and nurture it, that in our language are to do with, in this type of year you can't go there because of the spirits, but also, like the biologist would say, at that time of year in that part of the forest some kind of reproductive process is happening for keystone species. So there's always a reason, depending on how the storytelling frames it. And all oral tradition, cultural tradition that is going on all levels, from the shamans to the storytelling, to the songs, to everything, is informing people, is the lifelong learning process by which that culture has transmitted that deep knowledge of how to be in place over time. But then, because of the contact with other ways of living, the youngsters, after, if they put on a 3-day ceremony, the youngsters say after a day and a half, how much longer is this ceremony going to go on? And can we now get out of these clothes and get back to our recharging station to look at our mobile phones or something? And what they had to do, and what they seemingly did successfully, is to turn into the skid and say, okay, well, video our ceremonies, make documentaries about this knowledge for your age group.
Yeah.
So, and suddenly it became more engaging again, and invite a process. It's still questionable whether that's the way forward, but it in this particular instance it seemed to help. But for me, what I, in this context, I'm concerned that some of the technologies we're working on, the wonderful people in our regenerative movement are trying to build, that are based on crypto, this, that, and the other, and monitoring, and sensor, and proof of change of state, and all those kind of sensible building blocks in our Western logical frame, to put everything in place that we can then value the work of people who steward land, not just for the produce that they produce, but for the stewardship that they do on healing the land and maintaining the health of the land. But in the process, we also create an infrastructure that, for anybody who wants to access that wonderful benefit, also has to access the world of Zoom calls and mobile phones and technology and satellite monitoring and whatever it is. And is it inevitable? Like, is that where we're going? Like, for me, if we want to preserve diversity, do people not have the right to be Luddites if they want to be Luddites? Or do they not have the right to not use technology if they don't want to? Or if they choose to see how double-edged of a sword technology is, to only use it in a very limited way, and not be cut out of all sorts of the human agreement that we're now building, if they don't have a mobile phone, or they don't have an implanted chip, or they don't have whatever is coming at us?
Yeah. I think two things, and I think that's why I was super careful with how I said what I said, because I think for me it's like resourcing the, what we, in Regenerosity we talk a lot about those doing the planet's most critical tasks. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it's resourcing them with money, with time, sometimes with opportunity for peer-to-peer learning and exchange, but ultimately trusting that they are the ones that, like, I think I would also like to trust that the people that are still connected to a deeper sense of knowing would have the discernment to choose whether to engage or not with the technology, and then to do it in an appropriate way. And I know that's also a bit naive of me, but like as you said, I'm connected to lots of like little networks, and one of the most beautiful things that we catalyzed also through Lush and through my work at Lush and the work of others, like Simon and the work of Springprize that you are also involved, is Realliance. So re-alliance.org. And it's the idea of working in the nexus between humanitarian and development, but creating, you know, a group of practitioners that can mutually support each other.
That's the network that
And
grew out of Blueprint, yeah?
yeah, exactly. That came out of Blueprint. Yeah, and then came out of Springprize, because we
Yeah.
met in Springprize and we decided to add a meeting after Springprize, calling a lot of actors, and that Lush gave also some catalytic funding. We're fundraising now for the second year, but it was, you know, paramount to get that funding from Lush. And we're having these really beautiful calls where you have people that are, you know, working in CAFOD, and people that are in Bangladesh working in the refugee camps there. And then we have Morag, you know, amazing permaculture teacher from Australia. And then you have, you know, Caleb and all the amazing people in Kenya that are really doing incredible response to COVID-19 in their communities by like trading food for perennial plants. So they'll give food if people commit to planting perennial food crops. You know, like, and that's the kind of space that we need to create, where we're really honoring that knowing, and we're really allowing, and the reason why I said that is because they decided to together develop a radio training program. So it's super accessible, and it doesn't have to rely on technology, on smartphone, on whatever. How can we teach regeneration and permaculture taught by, you know, peer to peer, but also with amazing support from Morag and amazing support from Hannah Apricot. And yeah, so it's a really cool, I love this idea. Or for example, like Boniface in Bangladesh, you know, he was struggling to be able to come up with a COVID-19 response that was more regenerative, because they're so in the thick of it,
Yeah.
you know, and it's all about food and cash. And then they self-organized a design support group for Boniface to bring in different perspectives. And then again, it's people from the global north and the global south. And then the result of that is beautiful, you know. Then we have
Boniface,
yeah,
I know through Guy Education has a number of projects, learning projects with him. So is that still the same project, or is it a parallel project?
It evolved now. He's working a lot in the refugee camps with the Rohingya in Bangladesh, you know, the enormous million people refugee camps. Lush has been funding him, I think, for the past 2 or 3 years. And then, yeah, and then I think it's really interesting to be working with someone that is right in the thick of it. Like we also have, also part of this team of this alliance are people in Uganda that are, you know, working directly with refugees and home gardens, you know, in the land that refugees receive when they settle in Uganda. And it's interesting to bring the immediacy of the work to the table.
That's what I loved about like learning through you about Blueprint and the realignment, that it is so clearly actually building the skills of the intervention teams as well. Like all those people are learning a lot by helping and learning processes of how to help more effectively and how to really build capacity locally quickly and work with local actors together. But at the same time, it's immediately helping the people that most need it, and that's so. I mean, that's true.
And it's interesting because, for example, in some cases, it's like really what they really need are mosquito nets, you know, and we know mosquito nets are plastic. It's going to create plastic waste, but they have like a dengue outbreak, so what they need are mosquito nets. So how do you bring, like, in the sense of immediacy, how do you then keep upholding this bigger vision of regenerative design and development and building local capabilities and strengthening the local resilience that goes beyond mosquito nets, but you don't turn down the mosquito net because it's plastic, you know? Like, how can we be constantly holding that space of the emergency and the emergence, you know? Like, and I think we have other partners like Sarah Keblating as well in the Philippines doing this work really well. And this is where I think, like, the more we can mix these responses and mix the conversations, the more we're learning happens so fast in these circumstances. That's how I feel about it. You know, like, because it's being based, we're taking theory to practice in a way that immediately bumps into a reality shock. Like we're constantly, it's like we're bringing the reality shock into our theories the whole time. Like we're testing it. So yeah, so I'd like to create more those thriving conversational dialogue spaces that have an immediacy connected to them. And because we're seeing what's happening with the pandemic and all these multiple crises that now, it's going to be the pandemic, climate change, the economic downturn, it's going to be on our face all the time. So, okay, what is the strength of our living systems theory that can face reality and like head on, like we're facing the grim aspect of reality where millions of people are going to die? How can we really hold this principle even in the thick of it? And like this makes me alive. I also honor being alive at this moment where
I
we have the
honor feeling
opportunity
the
to
aliveness.
experience that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even through the virtual means, I can feel the power, and that's what I so love about your work. And I mean, one of the, we've only got another 15 minutes, and then you have to
I know.
go to another call because you've got busy
Yeah,
things to
I was
do.
gonna bring regenerosity as well into this.
Like we, for me, regenerosity really grew out of the
You.
frustration of the Lush Springprize judges. Like after sitting with the judges for 3 years of saying, this is wonderful, these projects are all worth, like the ones that came through to us, of the 50, 52, 53 that we got to read the applications for the Lush Springprize to, I always felt there were one or two, maybe three, that I had some question marks where I was like, sure, how did that get through the due diligence process? They sound like they're talking really all the right language, but I don't see them actually doing it or being able to do it. But apart from these little red flags that slipped through, 97% of them were just like, I don't want to just give them that much money. I want to give them more money, and I want to give it every year, and all of them. And then we just started this conversation of looking more into the whole, how much, by making it participatory and celebratory and bringing people together and doing all the social weaving, which is what Lush does so beautifully around the Springprize, it also makes it expensive because lots of people come to Emerson College and all that. But it is actually so much part of the price. I think the gift that these activists from all over the world and practitioners from all over the world get by being in a community from all over the world, seeing the significance and feeling celebrated by each other, is super powerful and worth the money spent. But when I realized that the back end of the price was almost as expensive or equally, maybe even more than what was being given away, I was thinking that this pattern must happen in all these other prizes too. And then we started to have this conversation. And I mentioned that, how about Buckminster Fuller Institute? They're in the same situation. And then I asked David McConville, is it true? Is the back end more expensive than the front end? Yeah, it is.
In their case, it was much more, even more.
And so I'm so glad that this has evolved now, and that it's actually moved over to be held by BFI in terms of the C501 status and all that. But I have kind of lost a little bit contact with it because of my own life and all the diversity of things we're holding. So where is it now? Like, how's it evolved?
So we have an offer on the table. So maybe let me backtrack a little bit. I think with Regenerosity, I think at the heart of it, like, we know that only 2% of philanthropic money around the world goes to environmental causes. And we all know, the speed and the level of regenerative work that needs to be done now. So again, I think our main goal is to create space for mutual learning. So, the kind of funders and donors can also learn from the projects, and the projects can learn from each other. And then we create this kind of thriving, fast learning space where there is a better understanding of what's actually needed, really at the grassroots level. Because I think there's a lot of money that ends up in the hands of the big NGOs doing environmental work, but very little gets into the hands of, indigenous communities, people of color, and, smallholder farmers, and and the people that are really actually getting their hands into the earth. So we are about to launch our launch event, which is going to be already a webinar. And we also want to talk to you because we want to invite you, a webinar to bring donors and funders, but also we want to become a platform for the voices, like the regenerative voices that are coming from the ground, and build this relationship that can be more long lasting in order to, of course, allow the financial money to flow. And then we got an offer of match funding of €500,000. So if we can raise €500,000, we already have a match funded. So I think that's a really interesting opportunity, and that money would go to projects, but it would also help us build the network. And we created a really beautiful nested holes theory of change, where, you know, we understand that change done at one scale can also create more health for the other scale, and then more health, and that how can we also hold the complexity of what we're trying to do in our theory of change. Yeah, so we spent a lot of development work in order to write a big application fund, and that's where we are. Like we are in this space of about to launch more publicly this initiative, and we are in the time of fundraising, so we can flow capital. And then just to say that we have a combined list of, I think, 500 vetted projects. Wow. And we've been reaching out to the projects to update on their needs. So we're trying to get a new sense of what the projects require. And then Regenerosity is also in conversation with other people doing the same thing. So trying to move more money to regeneration, so we can always work at a meta strategic level. And then also working with other organizations like Common Earth Alliance, and Realize and GRC and others that are looking to, can we create a shared backend where we're sharing information, even if, you know, our front end is talking to different stakeholders. But I think our main thing is to go into funding, to transform philanthropy for the just transition as well, and, you know, decolonizing wealth and all of that.
Where I had a little bit of a moment where I felt like, okay, help in birthing the impulse, but now it's kind of moving somewhere where I'm my own gut feeling was starting to get a little bit uncomfortable. But I think it's evolved from that intermediary stage, was when it was sort of going a little bit into a model of, well, this is this learning community and you buy into it, and then like it created a barrier, and also by mixing philanthropy and impact investment, I feel like that's where the vultures come back. Yeah, and there is a role, to my mind, to be really clear that the returns over the long term to the health and wholeness of the whole system is what your return on investment is. And so it's okay to sink money into projects that are truly regenerative, because the returns are multifold. They're just so systemic that you might as well not waste money in trying to monitor them in detail, because you would only catch part of it.
So I think the reason we went there, and I think we still want to go there, is the bulk is flowing philanthropic capital as gifts to projects, and then also coming up with better ways of monitoring that, you know, don't create so much more work for the projects. Mm-hmm. But there is a really, let's say, dark aspect of philanthropy, which is the foundations receive this big endowment. They're only spending 5% a year, or you create the donor advised funds. So all of those funds are invested. Yeah. So a foundation that is only donating 5% a year, the rest of the money is invested. And often the philanthropic capital is invested in the same shit that's causing all the destruction everywhere, right? So it's like,
you generate the money that you're giving away by regenerative activity, and then pay a little bit of regeneration, and
exactly,
you lose a lot of the money. And so it's
so we didn't want to go into normal impact investment. We just wanted to offer an alternative for philanthropic capital to be invested in regenerative enterprise. Because when you look at our whole like 500 project database, a lot of those projects are regenerative businesses that actually need investment, you know, and that can actually give financial returns.
That's
that's our aim.
the other dimension that I feel is so critical that we, in our conversations as we're sort of developing this in the beginning, got to the insight that there is a need for, I think at the time we called it either pulverization or whatever we were like, it's this process of, without creating a system that siphons off money, like that takes too much of a cut for doing this process, to create a process by which the large foundations that basically 500,000 is a small grant that doesn't even go to the board of directors. It just gets either signed off or not signed off. It's a decision of a split second, and people are putting lots of effort in getting there and writing large applications and spending huge amounts of hours to get into that split second opportunity to maybe get the small grant. Well, that small grant for a lot of organizations that are among those 500 would be too much money to handle at one moment in time. It would blow their organization apart. They would invest in the wrong things. They would transform in a non-regenerative way. But the same organizations, if somebody, instead of saying, we've got 500,000 for you this year, would say, we have a commitment to give you 50,000 for the next 10 years. So you keep doing what you're doing and grow organically and slowly and build your team. They would do amazing work with that. And so this need to create the intermediary where the large funds that we can't change at this moment can be approached and say, give us $1 million or give us $2 million, which is still small money for you. We're going to do the rest of splitting this to 30, 40 projects instead of one. I think is super important.
But we've just done that. So we've just spent hours and hours and hours of our time, hours. We figured we must have spent maybe $40,000 worth of work to jump through all the hoops to get $1 million. Yeah. And then we, so we have to do that work of jumping through the hoops to get $1 million. And it's so difficult because we're not big enough. And, there are then all the hoops and Daniel, it's so interesting.
Scandinavian furniture.
Yeah. And the thing is, because then we're holding a lot of complexity and we're thinking so systemically, then they came back one day and said, it's very hard. We can't fit you into a box. Like, we have these boxes of what we want to fund, and we can't fit you into any box because you're not really doing pure climate change, and we're also not doing pure gender, and you're also not doing pure like poverty alleviation. But like our aim is like co-benefits. If you do regeneration right, you tackle all of those things. Yeah,
put us a little bit of us in every box, or change your boxes.
Exactly, but that's not how these big foundations work. So now I think we're changing our strategy to go into, individual donors that have already figured out that we don't even have the time for them to spend all the money that they have. Like, we just have no, like, if you're a billionaire at the moment, if you're not trying to become a millionaire by donating your billions, like, you're like wasting everyone's time, because you're not going to spend billions. Your children are not going to inherit that money. They're not even going to be able to spend it. Like, there will be no world. Like, there will be no planet. Yeah, if we continue. So it's like, it's pointless to be accumulating so much capital. Now it's the time to use all the capital that we have to increase ecosystemic function. It's going back to that life. Life as the guiding force, life at the heart, life at the core.
The basis of all value creation on planet Earth is planetary bioproductivity and biodiversity and the health and wellness of the process of life. That's the basis. And so all the other things it's nonsensical to hold zeros and ones on a computer. But I just wanted to share one story briefly with you before we go. You met Oliver Karius from LGT Venture Philanthropy.
I don't think so.
They're the people who organized that meeting that I went to last October.
You told me about that.
And I learned a lot there, because I also saw how many of the large foundations in California are kind of applying a sort of, how do you grow a unicorn.com company? I know how to manage things approach, to then, how are we going to show these people to scale up and be more efficient with their wonderful little project in Africa? And it felt really like not 100% comfortable with some of these large monies, how they use the fact that they have a lot of money to then transform the processes that they're actually supporting rather than support them. But there were also wonderful other projects in the room, and one of them is this kind of flagstone project of their work is with the Masai Mara Game Reserve and the nature conservancies around the game reserve. But all the sort of blended business models that they've created still were basically using tourism money to pay to local farmers to do regenerative agriculture instead of degenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
And it worked beautifully, and it started to grow naturally because everybody was saying, oh, wow, you get some money to do the work in the way that you'd really like to do it. And now with COVID-19, that whole model is in danger of collapsing. So there's also a need of not building these blended models that are too dependent on these Robin Hood-like repurposing of money from one degenerative industry into regenerative practice. But
again, it's the transition. Like, we need this money now to build local resilience and local economies, like local resilience and local regenerative economies, you know, and to help regenerate ecosystems so they can really support local populations, right? This is really about increasing the carrying capacity of bioregions to support populations without having to rely, you know, on imports or having to rely on future, like borrowing from the future. And I think if we can use that money to build the capacity now, then as systems unravel, which we know, you know, they will be, then we are just, we're better capable of weathering the storm, so that, you know,
I mean, that's exactly,
so we can continue evolving, right? That's the thing. Like, again, we go back to evolution and life.
I mean, that's the huge opportunity that I see right now in so many places that are hit by a crisis that, like, when we were talking 8 months ago, pre-pandemic situation, so much
good old times.
Well, not really. The thing was that the established players, whether it was the car industry, the fossil fuel industry, the tourism industry, were making a mint in such a way that they were like saying, what's the problem? There is no problem. You're talking about something that might happen in the future. But now all these heavy hitters with all their big lobbies and all their power of influencing political process are queuing up to get government support. And ultimately the government is financed by us, by taxpayers. And the voice has been strong enough to say we need a different normal, not the back to the destructive, degenerative normal that we had before. And so there is a huge opportunity now to say, okay, if you're going to put what would have 8 months ago been unimaginable sums of money in political wielding and collaboration between different sectors and so on, interaction, then let's build bioregional resilience and climate resilience at the community scale. Let's build like, if we're going to have to pump stuff in, let's build the infrastructure that can hold us in the disruptions that are definitely coming in the future, rather than build an even more
propping up the fossil fuel industry or the aviation industry, which is insane. And I think in Europe this is much stronger than in the US, for example. I think there are quite a few, you know, the German government has said something about this, the Danish government, even the British government has said something about this. I think the idea of restarting the economy, you know, with the idea of a Green New Deal, which then literally would be a Green New Deal, after the recession. I think at the moment, this is where we can join forces. You know, this is where we can get everyone of all the movements. It doesn't matter if you're, you know, taking a reformist or a revolutionary approach. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, if you're working on corporate sustainability or if you're Extinction Rebellion or, you know, like, I think we can have this collective push. I think this can be the unifying voice now, is like, look, as we restart the economy, let's restart it better. And then the diversity is the approaches, right? Of course, there's going to be a corporate approach. And of course, there's going to be a, you know, EU level approach. But then we also need to make sure that the community-based approaches are included, and then we're developing that too.
And
I have
ultimately,
to go.
yeah, okay, you have to go. This was wonderful, and
I'm so
we
sorry.
could. There's so many things that we didn't get to, but this was really lovely. And I'll see you on Sunday at this
Yay! Yeah.
podcast.
Well, Sunday will be part 2. We can maybe
Yeah.
we can maybe continue.
Mwah. Thank you so
Mwah. Thank you
much.
so much.
Makes
Bye
me
bye.
happy to know that you're out there doing your work. So
Thank you. Likewise.
bye.
Thank you.